Rouxbe, and also one of the chef instructors in the courses among our team of about a half a dozen or so instructors here. And today I want to welcome you specifically to my office hours. And this is your chance to ask questions that pertain to food and cooking. And I'll do my best to answer those. And, as we start out today, I'd like to mention the usual couple of housekeeping items. And, the first thing is if you look at your screen, you'll see a dialog box on your screen on the right side. If you'd like to participate more directly in today's program, by sharing a question or even a comment, feel free to insert that, and it'll make its way to the queue. And also regarding the queue, you'll see a number of questions already loaded by our viewers, our participants today. And as you look at the individual questions, you'll see a heart-shaped icon. And if you would like that or a particular question addressed sooner than later, feel free to click on the icon and it'll push it up in priority. Okay, and those are the couple of announcements before we get started. We have a nice selection of questions today. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. And the first one is from Joyce, who says, what type of plant-based dishes freeze well? Thank you. Well, I was just reminded a few short minutes ago that perhaps the best category of plant-based food that freezes well would be popsicles, but that's probably not exactly what you're wondering, Joyce. So regarding other sort of savory preparations that you might see on the dinner table, let me begin by talking about freezing and thawing, that cycle more generally, regardless of what the food item is. Keep in mind that most things freeze pretty well. And generally, if an item is, on one hand, higher in moisture content, i.e. watery, like a soup, it will freeze pretty well and come out the other end, meaning after it's thawed, fairly stable. These are water-based products I'm thinking of at this point. And then at the other side of that spectrum would be very dry items, which can go through that freeze-thaw cycle and come out fairly nicely, but with a little bit softer texture. Okay, and so this is where freezing affects texture, generally speaking. So regardless of what the food item is, okay, again, most things freeze pretty well, but do expect some changes. Okay, I'm going to preface my next comments or thoughts by saying that when you buy frozen foods at the store, okay, whether it's a Hungry Man TV dinner or whether it's blueberries from the frozen aisle, those things go through a flash freeze cycle where they are frozen in a matter of seconds in a very, very cold environment. And in the case of fruits and vegetables, they are frozen individually. In other words, they're laid out on a conveyor belt that'll run through this freezing equipment. And we call that individually quick frozen product, or IQF product. Now, at home, most of us don't have access to this ultra cold, ultra fast freezing equipment. We've got our typical household freezers, which take a little bit longer. And so what happens is water expands, it disrupts the cell membranes, and in other words, it tears them. And therefore, when things thaw, the texture gets a little slack, a little bit soft. And so that's the most common result of freezing a lot of food items. Okay. Now, with that in mind, understand that once things are thawed, if you are using them in a moist environment, like making a soup or a stew or a casserole, then all is well. You're probably going to notice very little by the time the food hits the table. Okay. But if you have in mind that you want to saute or otherwise apply a dry heat cooking method to these items, then you may notice less control over the texture. Okay, so in other words, the texture may be softer than you had in mind, softer than you desire, and there's really no way to recover. Okay, that's just the nature of pushing food through the freeze thaw cycle. Okay. Um, Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that there are some items like let's say sauces that have some thick base to it, whether it's heavy cream or half and half, or it could be a nut puree. These things can separate upon thawing, in which case usually they can be reincorporated enough to to get through the cooking process at hand at that point. Okay, and this is actually going to be true of other sauces as well, like a tomato sauce or some of the puree that you might have. It is very possible that some separation of the water component from the solids may occur. And again, usually reincorporation, either with a spoon or with a whisk, will bring those two components together in a more stable puree form to get us through the cooking process. Okay, and beyond that, Joyce, it's going to take some practice on your part to freeze the things that you want to freeze, that you think you might want to store in the freezer. Okay, and just see how it turns out. All right, if it's going to be to your satisfaction. Um, keep in mind also that when we put things in the freezer, the best practice is to label and date items. I must say that on occasion, I will still just hastily put something in the freezer without a label, thinking, of course, I will recognize this, 2 or 3 months from now. And I don't. And so things get kind of looked over or maybe covered up by other things. And as time passes, I'm just sometimes guessing what these things are as I finally pull it out of the freezer into the fridge to thaw over the next day or 2 or 3, whatever is necessary, and then try to figure out what it is and decide what to make at that point. But anyway, best practice, label and date your food items. And anything in the freezer will certainly extend the shelf life, but understand that quality deterioration also begins pretty quickly. So, things have a shelf life in the freezer. And it's not that the item is going to spoil per se in the freezer, but the eating quality will decline. And so, for example, at the extreme, we'll experience freezer burn, which is a drying of the surface. Fundamentally, one of the things that happens in a freezer and the refrigerator as well is that moisture is extracted. And so things will tend to dry on the surface. So whether it's a vegetable item or a meat, you can get what we call freezer burn, which is drying. And there's no reversing that effect. You can trim it off, or you can just cut it smaller and put it in a stew and hope you don't notice it too much. But in other words, try to use your frozen products, within, say, 3 or 4 months. Will they last longer? Sure, they will. But the quality will be declining along the way. Okay. And so set your own standard and then go forth with your freezer program. Thank you. All right. Hello, Sue. Sue says, I really like the vegetable stock from class. Is there any way to get the same flavor in the Instant Pot? Also, are there any Instant Pot classes that would be coming up through FOK courses? So when we talk about an Instant Pot, we're talking about generally a pressure cooker. In this case, it's an electric and electronic pressure cooker, but it could well be the old school version that sits directly on the fire. Okay, and the quick answer is yes. You can make stock. You can do so many of these things that call for simmering as the primary cooking method in a pressure cooker. Will the results be exactly the same? Maybe not exactly the same, but they're probably going to be pretty darn close, and you may not even notice the difference. Okay, one thing that happens in a pressure cooker is that evaporation doesn't occur quite as quickly. Okay, as when you have a pot on the stove and no lid or a loose fitting lid. Okay, so keep that in mind. But one way to work around that is once something like stock or otherwise something that's very high in water content, like a soup or a stew, let's say, is that you can take the lid off after the primary cooking process is finished and then just allow it to reduce. In the case of these electric pressure cookers on the saute or sear setting, okay, and you can get a result that's going to be very, very close to a stovetop method. Okay, as with any cooking, keep in mind a couple of things. The first is that as we start to change the original recipe, whether it's an ingredient change or a cooking process change, we should expect some differences in the final product. Okay. And then number two, there's going to be some practice that's required, I think, in most cases, in order to fine tune the process in your own kitchen, okay, based upon your equipment and the particular foods that you're cooking. Okay, it always varies a little bit from kitchen to kitchen. All right, thank you. And let's see, the next question comes from Jessica, who says, how do you decide which moist heat method to use? Okay. Yeah, this is a great question. And, certainly, with experience, right, you're going to figure out how foods react to different cooking methods. You're going to have your own personal preference that comes forward. But generally speaking, when it comes to moist heat cooking methods, we're talking about two general categories, two subcategories. One would be steaming, and one would be the submersion methods. Okay, then in the submersion subcategory, we can further divide that into braising and stewing, and I would also include simmering, as a cooking method that we could talk about as a variation of the moist heat cooking category. Okay, so let's start first with steaming. Steaming is generally a pretty quick process. Now we can certainly adjust the heat and therefore the intensity of the steaming process, but generally speaking, it's a relatively quick process. So it's going to be best suited for food items that are relatively small in size. Okay, whether it's going to be smaller cuts on vegetables or whether they are um, uh, uh, bao, like small buns. We can certainly make larger things like cakes, as well. But still, cakes would be a tenderer product, usually fairly shallow, that will cook relatively quickly within this bigger context of our discussion here. Okay, so that's kind of the filter or the bounds of choosing steaming, okay, as a method. Um, Now, when it comes to this other category of submersion methods, so we've got braising, we have stewing, we've got simmering. Braising, we also refer to as a combination cooking process, where classically, right, we're going to combine some element of dry heat cooking to impart browning and therefore deeper flavor, greater flavor development, and then also the moist heat simmering process, okay, to tenderize the food. And braising, again, classically, there are certainly exceptions that people have come up with these days, but classically, braising is applied to larger food items. Stewing is the same sort of an approach. It's a hybrid or combination method employing both dry heat and moist heat. Dry heat for browning, impartation, and flavor development, and then the moist heat simmering process to tenderize the relatively tough food item. But stewing involves smaller cuts of items. Okay, and then simmering is a process that is just singular. In other words, it does not employ a dry heat browning component classically. Okay, now that the term simmering is also used more generally. So in other words, if we're braising an item, we can in our conversation, okay, in our language of the kitchen, we can say something like, "Let's brown the item." And then top off the pot with our cooking liquid, whether it's water or a flavorful liquid like stock. And then, we'll finish that process by simmering. Let's bring that to a boil. We'll reduce it to a simmer and hold it at that gentle simmer until the item is fork tender well done. Okay, which is typically the benchmark of doneness for a braised or a stewed or a simmered item. Okay. Um, Now, how do you choose between those? So, on one hand, I just explained a little bit between braising and stewing, larger items versus smaller items. Again, classically speaking, with exceptions. Okay, there seem to be always exceptions in the kitchen. Um, if you want to impart color and strive for this extra layer of flavor development, then um, the combination cooking methods of braising or stewing are called for. Steaming, on the other hand, will not impart any browning. It's just a straight up cook it in a wet environment, and but with some control over the intensity of the steam. Okay, but usually with relatively smaller or tender items. And as I use the word tender, that's where perhaps a larger item like a cake can be steamed because it's tender, cooks relatively quickly. Okay. Um, and where we have overlap, okay, between what steaming might do and what braising or simmering might do, it becomes your personal preference on what you choose. Okay. And so that ultimately is going to be the beauty of cooking, is that as you gain understanding of cooking methods and therefore control over recipes, you get to make the choice on what is going to be convenient, what is going to be practical for your environment, what's going to be best for your time constraints, what is preferable for your audience, for example. Okay, and so have fun with that. There's a lot of nuances that you get to play with and learn about through these various processes. And as always, have patience. Cooking takes a long time to refine and to understand, a number of years even. And so have fun with the process. Happy cooking. All right. Next up, we have a question from Linda, who says, I am looking for clarification on what oils to use when cooking. And Linda references tasks 89 and 90 from the Pro Plant course. Are grapeseed oil and virgin coconut oil the go-to oils, or are there other options such as avocado oil or light olive oil? Aha. So the cooking fat or cooking oil question here. Let me start out by saying that I like to cook in a low stress environment, and um, generally speaking, I don't get too caught up in some of these uh, uh, these uber details of one oil versus another. Okay, necessarily. Um, but let me address this from a couple of angles. Okay, from a health perspective, there are certainly different nutrient profiles that are associated with different oils. Okay, more refined oils will have more of their inherent nutrients removed, and so they're really not offering you as much as a less refined oil could. Okay, now having said that, I mean, generally speaking, it's probably a good idea for most people most of the time to limit the amount of cooking oil that's added, okay, that's used, okay, during your day-to-day kitchen operations. All right. And so in other words, don't rely on oil as a significant source of your nutrients. All right. I think whole fats are a different story. If we're talking about eating avocados or olives or walnuts or almonds, for example, that's a different story. But when we're talking about cooking oils, generally, right, we want to limit the quantities there. Now, um, uh, when we think about nutrient profiles, I think olive oil, very often sort of comes to the top of the heap, so to speak. It's associated with the very helpful, health positive Mediterranean diet. And, folks have a lot of success, using that as their one and only oil. But again, I'll let you leave that to your preference. Some of those oil choices from a now culinary perspective, okay, can be dictated by the flavor profile. So, for example, in some regional cuisines, or maybe based upon your personal preference, coconut oil is preferred or not, or olive oil is preferred or not. Okay, other more refined oils are pretty neutral. Okay, my experience, avocado oil is neutral. Canola oil, right, is neutral. And as you get into these more highly filtered olive oils, like the light olive oil, they tend to be more neutral in flavor, or much, much lighter in flavor. Okay, so that choice becomes a personal one from a culinary perspective. Again, not a health perspective, but a culinary perspective now. Okay. The other consideration would be smoke point. And smoke point is a sort of a general category to talk about, or a way to look at oils, where visibly you start to see smoke coming from that oil as it gets to a certain temperature and exceeds that temperature. Okay, and generally speaking, we want to stay away from the smoke point and cook at something below that. Now, there are certainly a lot of nuances to this discussion. If we were to get into the chemistry of cooking oils and how different oils, based upon their constituent properties, are more or less resistant to heat. But I'll let you pursue that if you're interested through academic papers that are accessible through databases online. But otherwise, as from a culinary perspective, a general way or thing to keep in mind is just to kind of keep the oil below the smoke point, there's less damage that's done to the oil, and that rolls over into the culinary side of things because flavor and aroma can be negatively affected, and then also into the health side of our discussion, because the positive aspects of the oil can decline, and negative health aspects can increase if that's the way we are handling the oil. Okay, so ultimately, there's, in my opinion, no single go-to oil. This is an individual decision based upon perhaps your family culture or maybe some other beliefs or information that you want to base your decision on. Okay, and it can certainly be situational, as I mentioned, based upon the regional cuisine that you may be preparing. Okay, and so think about all these things and how you might want to proceed with the way that you select your cooking oil. Thank you. All right, and next one is from Nancy Z, who says, "Hi there. Why do soups and stew recipes need tomato paste and crushed tomatoes? Can we just choose one?" Thank you. The quick answer for the reason why some of these recipes call for multiple types of tomato products is because each is a little bit different in its flavor profile that's lent. And so the end result is this layering of flavor that's developed through the multiple processes of cooking. Okay. And so these different types of tomato products, generally speaking, we've got tomato paste, we have tomato puree, and then we have fresh tomatoes or something just much, much more watery. And these have, different sort of acidity, sweetness, flavor intensities. And as you start to put these together at different points in the cooking process, there is some complexity that is created. And can you just choose one? Sure, you can. The resulting dish may taste a little different. It may be more or less noticeable depending on what you're making and your individual palate. But basically, that's the rationale. Okay, and so have fun again with experimenting. There's nothing wrong, right, with taking a recipe that calls for multiple types of tomato products and then maybe distilling it to just a single variety in your own kitchen as you get to know that cooking process and you become satisfied with the results. Okay, that is indeed the power, right, that we want to give you as you learn to handle cooking methods and then also come to understand how different ingredients function in different preparations as it's exposed to time and temperature. Okay, so the manipulation or the control of time and temperature are the two largest components, right, in most cooking processes. And a lot of fun experimenting, and I hope you will find enjoyment in that too. Thank you. Okay, next up, question says, hello, Janet. What is the best way to care for an iron skillet? Does it need to be oiled after every use, inside and out, and then put it in the oven to dry? So we've got a lot of absolute sort of terms here. Best way and need to be. All of this has some flexibility, okay, kind of just depending on the situation, all right? But let's say that generally, the second part of your question here sort of addresses the ideal way, to care for unlined cast iron. So not an enameled cast iron pot, but just a regular cast iron cookware. Okay, so it should be dry, ideally, and then as needed, apply some oil. I mean, one might say best practice is to apply oil every time. Sure, that could be the case, but also, take a look at it and see if it might require some oil. And like so many things in the kitchen, your experience will inform your process as time goes on. Okay. Uh, One thing is the cleaning process itself, and probably many of us have heard the horror story, whether it's a modern one or one dating from a couple of generations back, where somebody who was helping out and saw this blackened skillet and took the scrubby and stripped it clean. Only to be faced with this look of horror, by the main cook of the house, who had spent so much time building up that wonderful layer on the cast iron skillet. So there is some gentleness that is preferable, right, when cooking cast iron. And so, for example, especially when we're dealing with dry heat cooking methods, for example, saute, it's fairly common, for little bits of food and sauce to dry up and adhere to the surface of that skillet. In which case, after the cooking, after the food is removed from that pan, it's good to put just a little bit of water in the pan just to cover that surface of stuck-on stuff, and just let it sit while you move on with your cooking process and your meal, perhaps, and only to come back to that skillet later on when you'll find that the adhered product has softened from that warm or even hot water that's been sitting in that pan for some time. And at that point, the pan is much easier to clean without the need for aggressive scrubbing. And that's going to help you preserve and even build up that beautiful layer on the cast iron skillet. Okay. And so I think that part of the bigger picture is important to keep in mind as well. But yeah, otherwise, think about the oiling process, and if you see any rust spots or patches appear, and a lot of times it's not the inside, but the sides or the bottom, which might be exposed to direct heat, especially if it's a gas range that you're using or an open flame, let's say. So in which cases it's nice to exercise some maintenance with a light rub of oil. You can just put it back over the fire and let that sort of burn on or burn off, or however you want to look at that. It doesn't have to be in the oven necessarily to dry. You can also dry it with a towel to get most of the moisture out, and then otherwise let it sit and air dry. Okay, and again, some of this may depend on the ambient sort of conditions in your area. Okay. If you're in a very dry place, like Colorado or Arizona, probably moisture on the surface will dry up very quickly. But if you're in a more humid place, then a towel will help that process along. Okay, I hope that's helpful for you, Janet. Thank you. All right, next up from Elizabeth. When adding whole wheat flour to a bread dough, what do I need to change to get it to rise properly? Okay. Interesting. So we've got a situation here where we're talking about altering a baking recipe or formula. Okay, very often when we talk about baked goods, we use the word formula instead of recipe because a formula implies that the original sort of starting point, or let's say recipe, has been tested multiple times, and those ingredient quantities in conjunction with equipment and methods applied are sort of locked in. Not 100%. There's always going to be some room for adjustment, but we fine tune the ingredient quantities based upon those ingredient types, so the specifications of those ingredients that we're using. And then we call that a formula. At that point, we can just use that over and over in our bake shop, in our kitchen. And then we have to understand that as we take that formula to a different kitchen, to a different bakery, a different restaurant, a different house, a different region in the world, that some adjustments will be necessary based upon the specifications of the ingredients available to us or the climate, humidity level, altitude, and these other factors. Okay. Now, in the case of changing a refined flour, a white flour, to whole wheat flour. So we're changing the specification of an ingredient, in this case, the major ingredient in bread dough. All right. The biggest thing to keep in mind when using whole wheat is that it's got everything in it, right? It's got especially the bran is what I'm getting at. Bran is thirsty and it requires noticeably more water than its white flour or refined flour counterpart. Okay. And so if you're using whole wheat flour and without adjusting the water, then the dough, right, that you've mixed and that you've kneaded is going to be very tight due to the relatively low water content at this point. And so the rising process becomes more difficult for the yeast. And so what you need to do is increase the water. Okay. And it depends on just how much of the flour you're using. All right. So just as an example, if I'm gonna come up with just a broad example, here's some place for you to start your experimentation process. Okay. But if you're using, let's say, 3 cups of total flour, and maybe 50% of that was changed to whole wheat flour, you may need to increase the liquid by about a 1/4 cup. Okay, just as a starting point. Okay, my recommendation is to take notes and be prepared to do multiple tests in order to fine tune this recipe or this formula to fit your environment. Okay, and this change that you're making. Okay, but that's what's going on. Your dough doesn't have enough moisture. Thank you. All right, and next up from Shar. Nice to see you. Thank you very much. Look for recommendations for the most nutrient-dense rice for making sushi. Aha. So, let me start by saying that culturally speaking, right, from a Japanese perspective, sushi is based on white rice. White rice, like rice in general, is mostly a source of carbohydrates. In the case of white rice, there's not a significant amount of other stuff that comes along with that. Certainly, there are some smaller amounts of nutrients, but the aesthetic of the eating experience becomes primary with sushi, and so therefore, arguably the nutritional profile of the rice that's chosen is sacrificed, okay, for the aesthetic of the eating experience. All right, which then brings us to brown rice. Okay, so if we want to talk about a couple of broad categories of rice, one is going to be polished rice or milled rice or white rice, the resulting white rice, or brown rice, which has the bran layer and germ and endosperm intact. Usually, there are different types in the middle here on this spectrum of rice, but let's just talk about simply these two categories here. Brown rice is going to be by far the more nutrient dense choice. And I think in this day and age, to make sushi out of brown rice is quite acceptable. It's quite fine. Um, Understand, as I mentioned earlier in the program today, that when we make an ingredient change, that we should expect a change in the resulting product. And so in this case, if we're going to shift from the traditional white rice, Japanese style rice, to a Japanese style brown rice, that the results are going to be uh, more brown rice esque, meaning it's going to be chewier and firmer as a result of the bran layer. But the nutrient profile is going to be much more favorable, right? Than the white rice. And so we've got the bran itself, a source of significant, meaningful fiber in the diet. And fiber is one of my favorite F words. It is so important. And helping. We talk about these sometimes these very simple sort of correlations, like it tempers blood sugar, this sort of thing, which it does. But fiber does so much more in terms of our internal goodness. And then there are other phytonutrients, micronutrients that come along with brown rice. A set of minerals and vitamins are associated with the less processed or unprocessed rice at that stage. And but brown rice is the way to go as a quick answer. Now, let me shift back to white rice for a moment, okay? We can bolster the nutrient profile of white rice through the addition of other grains. And I'll give you a couple of examples, okay? So one is quinoa. And it doesn't matter what color you use, but quinoa cooks up very nicely together with rice. And that addition can bolster the nutrient profile of the resulting rice. And you can still cook it to maintain some nice texture as far as that eating aesthetic is concerned, okay? Millet is another grain that comes to mind that can be combined with rice to add some interest, some texture interest at a subtle level, as well as some flavor interest, and certainly a more interesting nutrient profile. Okay. Now, within this bigger context of rice in Japan, I'd like to add that, generally speaking, we associate white rice with Japanese food culture. But in Japan, there's a long history of combining other grains and even legumes with rice to bolster its interest and its nutritional profile. And millet is one example. Buckwheat, buckwheat, yeah, maybe not the best example with rice, but buckwheat is another grain or pseudo grain that has a long history in Japanese cuisine. And then we have beans that are added as well in some preparations. But there is a history of that, I guess is what I'm saying, in Japan. Quinoa is a more modern sort of grain in the context of let's say Japanese, the intersection with Japanese cooking. And the combination of quinoa with Japanese rice is one that I see more in, say, the United States, not something that I've seen in Japan. Okay, not that it doesn't exist today, but it's going to be a more modern sort of iteration of rice cookery. But that's certainly a way to up the nutrient profile. I hope that helps. Thank you very much, Shar. Okay, and then Cynthia's asking, do you have a recipe for the spices for chai tea? Okay, so for chai, Uh, I don't have a recipe per se. I think you can certainly look online for many, many examples of recipes, depending on a person's preference or maybe some regional example, which is really how these spices come together. Okay. And for a lot of people, a lot of households, the spice blend will also change from season to season, depending on just how you want those spices to affect your body. In other words, now I'm talking about a medicinal perspective on the spices and chai as a food substance, as a beverage. Okay, and I would be talking about this from an Ayurvedic perspective. Okay, so for example, in the cooler months, you might increase the warming or heating spices like black pepper or cloves or ginger. And in the warmer months, you might decrease those items, while using maybe more cardamom and cinnamon or turmeric, in your chai. And but some possibilities and some common ingredients that you see in chai, would include black pepper. It includes ginger. There's cinnamon. There's cardamom. There's cloves. Okay, as a starting point. I mentioned turmeric a second ago, and that's something that you see sometimes. It's certainly something that I like to use because of its wonderful health effects. Okay, and to try to put that in everything you eat, actually. But the other part of this is to approach this through some spirit of experimentation. Um, but as always, with so many cooking experiences, it's nice to start with somebody's recipe, just so you have a baseline, and then from there, feel empowered to make adjustments. Okay, and that's the best way for you to learn about the individual spice profiles and what they impart in the chai or to the chai, and how increasing black peppercorns by just 3 peppercorns can make a difference. In that small batch of chai that you might make, and you're only going to learn that by experimenting. Okay, you're going to understand the difference between using dried ginger powder and freshly grated ginger. Okay, you're going to learn the effects of freshly grated ginger on cow's milk or other milks as well. If depending on what avenue you take here. In other words, fresh ginger can cause curdling of milk, and therefore it's best to put ginger in early and let it simmer. It draws out the spices. It neutralizes the enzymes that would curdle milk. Then we add the milk to finish. And then as far as sweeteners are concerned, probably more times than not, right? Chai has a sweetener of some sort. That's totally up to you. Okay. If you travel to India and other points in South Asia, where chai is part of the daily custom, refined sugar, white sugar is what I usually see in places in India and Nepal, for example. But feel free to use other types of sweeteners. Okay. I have a supply of whole leaf stevia, dried stevia leaves here, which imparts a different type of sweetness profile. If you want to use a less processed sugar, such as jaggery or maybe a more common brown sugar, then give that a try and see how you like the results. Okay, once you again have some experience under your belt, you can call the process yours, and you get to sort of fine tune that to best suit your palate, and then also the audience for whom you're preparing the chai. All right, keeping in mind that it is completely fine to alter the chai based on the season, for example, throughout the year. Okay, and then you'll be making chai wherever you go. One thing that I do is when we're camping in the summertime, I always bring a big kettle, all the ingredients for chai, fresh ginger and peppercorns and cinnamon sticks and all that. I travel with a mortar and pestle. In this case, I'm not backpacking, right? We're in the car, and I'm grinding stuff by hand, and we're simmering right there. And the pot is big enough to share with whoever's walking by, and it's a beautiful thing. And so you will become a chai lover, and you will feel confident to do it the way that you like it, and in a way that comes out balanced, and hopefully in a way that makes sense, again, for the seasons from an Ayurvedic or medicinal standpoint, right, for your body. All right. Thank you. Okie doke. Next up, can you tell me more about miso and seaweed? I'm interested in attempting to buy some and start using it. Holy cow. A couple of big topic areas here. I'm going to start by answering this question, Cynthia, by saying, go out and buy some different types of things and start using it. In the case of the miso, open the containers, the bags, the plastic containers, and just taste them. Side by side is the best way to understand how ingredients taste. And we refer to this sort of a taste comparison as a cutting. That's a restaurant industry term, cutting, where we have multiple samples of a like item, and we line them up side by side, and then we'll taste them, and then we'll start doing things with them, right? We'll start cooking with them and see how they fare, right, when applied to against time and temperature. And so with miso, I mean, generally speaking, there are many types of miso in the world, well, in Japan anyway. But here in the U.S., broadly speaking, you'll find white miso, you'll find red miso, this darker brown colored miso. There's others in between, but white miso tends to have a sweeter profile and an overall lighter flavor intensity. Red miso is a more robust, salty profile. You can choose between varieties based upon the season. Maybe you want a more robust, sort of a hearty flavor profile imparted in the cooler months, kind of like braising is associated with cooking methods for the cooler months. Whereas a lighter miso soup might be more appropriate for light, hot weather soups. But again, totally up to you, okay? Some misos have been strained and are very smooth in consistency. Others have koji or elements of the base rice or soybeans are still in the paste. Some miso paste will have dashi incorporated into it. So dashi is the Japanese stock, which is traditionally made separately, right, as the flavorful liquid that goes into making miso soup anyway. So that's going to be a convenience product. Give it a try. See if you like it. I enjoy the process of making dashi and doing this and that. So I buy miso that's plain miso without the addition of dashi, but that's totally up to you. Okay. When it comes to seaweed, there are many, many different kinds. Okay. There's nori or laver, which usually comes in sheets. That's commonly associated with rolled sushi. Okay. But you can also just tear it or cut it into smaller pieces and use it to informally pick up rice or other food items. You like at that point it becomes kind of a small wrap that you can just pop in your mouth. And we see that in Japan. as well. So I'm not just making that up for the U.S. audience or folks outside of Japan. Okay, you've got kombu, which can be a couple meters long or more, and generally speaking, kombu is associated with making a one category of dashi, right, or the stock that I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago. And you can eat the kombu as well after you finish making the stock, simmering the kombu. Consider just slicing it up into thin pieces, an eighth of an inch or a quarter inch thick, and then put that into your soup. Add it into a different stew that you're making, or a casserole or something else. Other things are made from that as well. But it's a great food item, so you don't have to discard it as many recipes suggest, okay, after making stock or after making dashi, okay? There's hijiki, which are these short sort of pine needle shaped a type of seaweed that's then soaked and then combined with tofu dishes or vegetable dishes or put into soups. So they create a certain visual effect, a certain mouthfeel or aesthetic. They have a certain flavor associated with them. And there's so many more varieties of seaweed, but you got to give it a try. Okay. And if you can do some side-by-side testing, that's really going to push your understanding down the path very, very quickly. Okay, so I hope you'll give that a try. Thank you. All right, next up from Valentina. Hello. Question about rolling pins. If you can own only one, which type would you go for? Wow, I've never thought about that, Valentina. We've got, I don't know, multiple rolling pins, always within reach. This is a difficult question. There's marble and I think probably stainless steel, and we've got, these tapered, French rolling pins and larger diameter ball bearing, big rolling pins. In Indian cookery to make flatbread or chapati, you've got a tapered rolling pin again. We've got a short rolling pin to make pot sticker wrappers, jiaozi or gyoza wrappers. I've even taken a closet rod. I shouldn't say I took a closet rod, but I went to the hardware store and I bought an oak closet rod, okay, hanger rod, and I cut it into different lengths to make hardwood rolling pins. And then I think I oiled them with mineral oil or something like that, and even gave a couple of them away. But you can then customize the lengths depending on the size of your toolkit that you might take camping with you or traveling for catering, or the size of your drawer or whatever it is that you're making. So that's another thing to consider. Okay. So, one thing to keep in mind is that, some of these rolling pins, they're culturally, in a way prescribed or dictated, like if you're making, chapati, the flatbread in the Indian kitchen, there's a kind of a certain technique that's commonly used in the kitchen with the hands open and a thinner diameter tapering rolling pin that's used. And it works very well when you get used to that technique. If you're rolling out larger sheets of puff pastry or blitz dough or something, and you got a big table to work across, maybe you want a larger diameter rolling pin, nice ball bearings, big handles, so that in large diameter, so your knuckles don't hit the dough. Okay, as you're moving back and forth. Something with a little bit of weight is nice, right? To help do the work for you. So it's not you just, pushing down on the dough. That's where these larger rolling pins or a marble rolling pin can come in handy. Okay. So this is still a difficult question. I didn't come up with an answer for you, but I hope that those thoughts that I just shared will help you, choose a rolling pin or 5. All right, thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Bianca, who says, I am taking the Rouxbe baking course, and as a mixed batter, I wonder, how should a well-mixed batter look like? How would it look like over-mixed or under-mixed? Okay, wow, this is another great question associated with the bake shop. So let me first say that depending on what you're making, okay, there are different types of batters, and the benchmarks vary. Okay, so there's not a single answer that I can give you. Okay, but I will also say that when making, let's say, cakes, right? The number one issue, the most common problem, is over mixing. Okay, and the troubleshooting, right, comes out in the finished product. All right, so if we're working with a high fat product, such as a pound cake, over mixing will result in tunneling, or these long holes or tunnels that form inside the cake. And we notice that when we cut it open and we look at the cross section of the finished product. In the case of a lower fat cake, like a sponge cake, it will look like a depressed cake, one that didn't rise sufficiently. Okay, and so that's going to be some initial troubleshooting for over mixing. Okay, now if we back that process up to get us to the mixing steps, okay, the couple of steps of mixing, we've got the initial, usually in conventional baking is going to be eggs and, things in that first wet stage that you're blending. And there's going to be commonly air that's incorporated, okay, to bring some loft, okay, to that mixture. And then the flour is added to that. Now, the weight of the flour will always draw down or sort of compress that batter. Okay, but you want to pay attention to how much loft is being created in this initial mixing step of the wet ingredients, and then what it looks like as you're incorporating the flour. And the goal is to just incorporate the flour so that it's evenly incorporated. Okay, and then generally speaking, you're good to go. If we keep on mixing, again, which is the most common problem, then we see deflation and gluten development in the flour. Okay, and now on the other hand, if it's under mixed, we can see lumps. I'm talking about the cakes right now. We'll see lumps. We might see streaks or spots of dry flour. Those would be evidence of an undermixed batter. Okay, so at this point, it's going to be repetition that will inform you as to whether the batter is mixed well. So not under or not over mixed. Okay, so these are just a couple of general sort of tips to keep in mind, but really repetition, your experience is very, very important in the bake shop to better understand what the different steps of procedures and cooking method or mixing methods do, as well as how specific ingredients and combinations of ingredients act and react in that environment. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears here. Right, remember the first thing I said was it depends on the type of batter that you're making. Okay, there are other batters, let's say a pancake batter, okay, that can be mixed relatively lightly such that we do see some lumps in the mixture, okay, and it's okay. As it cooks, it turns out okay. In the case of some uh, batters for deep frying, such as for tempura, it's even desirable to leave some evidence of dried flour, little bumps or spots. And then once it goes through that frying technique, it all sort of turns out well. So it ultimately depends on what kind of a batter you're using, what you're making. Okay, so keep all of that in mind. And the biggest thing is to be engaged with that process and correlate that to the finished product that you've created. And then try to backtrack to just what it is that you saw, what it sounded like, use your full sort of sensory engagement, in the baking process. Okay, thank you. And then next up, we got a question from Carlene who says, I'm planning to make a soup using lupini beans. Should I remove the skin from the beans before I add them? This is going to be really 100% a personal decision, depending on your preferred aesthetic, okay, whether it's mouthfeel or the visual aesthetic that you prefer. I mean, generally speaking, there's nothing wrong that I can think of leaving bean skins in a food item, whether it's garbanzo beans or lima beans or something else, for most people most of the time. There may be exceptions in the way that some people react to bean skins, but by and large, it's going to be totally up to you. I recommend trying it both ways. Leave it in, remove it, compare the results, and see what you prefer. And, give it some analytical thought and come up with reasons why you like it a certain way or why you don't like it a certain way. Okay, rather than just saying, just because. I think it's good to push ourselves to a deeper understanding of our relationship with food. It only makes our cooking better. Okay, so give that a try. Thank you. All right. Next up from Craig, who writes, I had wrist surgery, so I cannot do the cutting for very long. Are there knives that are sharper than others? Currently, I have Hinkles, but with the blade so wide and heavy, it becomes an issue. Aha. Yeah, great question. There definitely are, knives that have a heavier construction and knives that have a lighter construction. And part of that is based upon the length of the blade, and part of that is also based on the thickness of the blade. Okay. Generally speaking, European style chef's knives, and so Hinkles would be an example of a brand that comes to mind. Wüsthof is another one, where the chef's knife is characterized by pretty heavy construction. And on the other hand, there are knives, I'm generalizing here, but in the Japanese tradition that tend to be thinner in construction. And they are lighter in weight. You can also choose knives, of course, that are shorter in length. But these thinner blades will slice through things pretty easily. And I'm talking things that are of light to medium density. Okay, that's important to keep in mind because there is some specificity of the type of knife you might choose based upon what it is you want to cut. In other words, if you have a knife that's too delicate and you try to cut things that are pretty hard, like an acorn squash, you run the risk of chipping the knife. In which case, maybe a heavier Hinkle's knife might be a better choice. Okay, but yes, there are definitely some knives out there that could make the cutting task for you a little bit easier. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Jeff, who says, I'll be cooking duck over the holidays for guests. What are some good whole food plant-based side dishes to accompany duck? I'll tell you, I'm a fan really of anything, um, which doesn't help you, I understand. But let's start with winter squash. I just mentioned a minute ago acorn squash, and so that's a place to start. Butternut squash, Hubbard squash, the Japanese kabocha type of squash. There are also sweet potatoes of various sorts. I'm a big fan of the purple Japanese style sweet potato, purple skin or deep red, kind of like magenta. Well, let's say deep red colored skin with a white flesh. I also love purple sweet potatoes. Those it's got a deep earthy flavor. Depending on the variety you choose, the sweetness level can vary from really like candy sweet to much more earthy in profile. It's got all kinds of nutrients, if you're just wondering about that. Those anthocyanins that we associate with beets and these other purple foods are just compressed, it seems, in these purple varieties of sweet potatoes. So those are a great choice. Other potatoes, of course, abound. And then other root vegetables. There are rutabagas, there are parsnips, there again, other celeriac or celery root is another choice. So root vegetables in general, can be a nice seasonally appropriate product that also goes nicely with duck. You can puree these items. You can blend them, with multiple items together. You can cut them in different shapes and sizes depending on the plate presentation that you might design or have in mind. You can, of course, flavor them in different directions with herbs, with spices. You can perfume them heavily or lightly or even not at all. Many of these items I just mentioned, like celeriac or a purple sweet potato, have so much personality on their own that you may not need to add anything to them, save a pinch of salt and pepper. Even bypassing those things could be fine. There's always things like green beans. There's Brussels sprouts. Those are all commonly available things that I have cooked with duck in the past that I enjoy. If you want to give Brussels sprouts a try, my recommendation is to really push the browning. So use a really high heat. If you're not oil averse, lightly oil the Brussels sprouts and develop some browning all around. On your initial roasting, put the cut sides down on the sheet pan because that full contact is going to develop some nice color. Okay, and then you can turn them over and continue the cooking process. But you develop this deep color and a little bit of a crunchiness on those outer leaves, and it adds a multiple dimensions at that point to the eating experience. Okay, and so that's a place to start. You can always another kind of fun thing to do, and this is a David Chang from New York City approach to Brussels sprouts. But buy some kimchi, put it in your blender. So you got to kimchi puree, and then lightly toss your deeply roasted Brussels sprouts in the kimchi puree and serve that. It just adds another little sweet, sour, hot, sort of a sassy sauce at that point. Okay. Um, Maybe you're going to dress up some roasted vegetables, a medley of roasted vegetables. Maybe you'll garnish that with some pomegranate seeds, some whole fresh pomegranate seeds for some color, as well as a fistful or two or three of fresh herbs. Mint leaves and thyme and oregano, maybe a bit of rosemary. All these things go very nicely with roasted vegetables as well. So, give these things a try. So long as they suit your palate, I don't think you can go wrong. All right. Thank you. All right. Another question from Blanca. I think maybe I said Bianca earlier. I apologize. Blanca. When cooking pasta, can I add dry pasta to cook with other ingredients together, say in a casserole? Or is it recommended to be cooked and drained separately? This is a great question. You can go either way. Again, one of the beauties of cooking is that you can learn to do things multiple ways, just depending on your situation. It could be time constraints. It could be space constraints. It could be, adherence to a regionally specific cooking method. There could be, various, reasons that influence your choice here. But let me say a couple of specific things. That is, if you cook pasta separately, okay, for whatever you're doing, whether it's a soup, right, or a pasta dish or a casserole or whatever, if you cook the pasta separately, you're going to have the most control over the texture, over the degree of doneness of the pasta. Okay. And then, if you can look ahead and think about, how long the pasta is going to sit with the other components of this dish and how wet it might get and how much it might soak in the watery component, the juices, the sauces, then you can adjust the degree of doneness of the pasta in that initial step. Okay, we talk about cooking pasta al dente, but you can make it even harder, right, or less done if you know it's going to sit together with something during the meal or just prior to going to the table. Okay, so this is what I mean by you have more control over the textural quality of the pasta. Now, on the other hand, in the name of convenience, perhaps you can certainly incorporate pasta into a dish to make it a one-pot meal, such as a casserole. You just need to adjust the water, right, or the liquid content appropriately so that everything is going to be cooked to the degree that is appropriate. Okay, so you don't have underdone pasta. One of the worst things in the world, I'm sure. Okay, and that's going to take some practice on your part. Always take notes while you're cooking. That's my recommendation for everybody. I live by those rules. I've got a notebook, pen, within about 2 or 3 steps in the kitchen, and I'm always taking notes for these sorts of things. Okay, but you can do it either way. Just depends. Thank you. And from Dr. KK, who says, good afternoon, Chef Eric. Thank you for another interesting and informative session. Thank you very much, Dr. KK. And thank you all for joining me today for my office hours. I appreciate all of your participation, and I wish you happy cooking until we meet again. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.